Thank you so much, Congressman Meijer, for joining me. I appreciate it. First of all, let's start with your trip to Afghanistan and how do you assess the situation in Afghanistan on ground? Especially you have the background from humanitarian side and also intelligence. Tell us about your trip.
Yeah, thank you, Zheela. So I went with Congressman Seth Moulton from Massachusetts. He serves on armed services. I serve on foreign affairs and also homeland security. So we try to represent all of the relevant committees. We did this very quietly. Our goal was to see the situation on the ground, to learn as much as we could and as quickly as we could, and then to leave so we were not a burden on the forces who were there. At the airport, it was obviously a lot of chaos at the gates, at Abbey Gate in particular. This was 2 days before the horrific Daesh bombing at the gate. But what we saw was, American forces and the Taliban almost next to each other, just a few meters separating them, a very hard position for American soldiers and Marines and airmen to be in. We saw a massive evacuation effort. Over 100,000 individuals have been evacuated since August 14th, and that includes, our trip included visits to Ali Salim Air Base in Kuwait, where there is one of the processing centers for individuals coming from Afghanistan, and also Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, where there's the largest of those processing centers. So we saw, a massive effort and mission to get individuals to safety, but also just how impossible that mission was given the challenges on the ground, and just the enormous number of people who needed help.
Yeah, you mentioned the ISIS attack at the airport, and there was also a retaliation attack at the same time. And Taliban also gave repeatedly warning U.S. after August 31st as a deadline or occupation of Afghanistan. Is there any way that U.S. may consider incentives to Taliban if they want to continue evacuation of Afghan allies?
Yeah, I think we'll see efforts. To be very clear, our mission does not end on August 31st. The military component may end, but we still have an obligation to get the individuals who were left behind, especially those special immigrant visa holders or folks in that pipeline who will be approved. I think one of the reasons why the U.S. in the short term needs to maintain cooperation with the Taliban is to make sure we can still get those American citizens out, those SIV holders out, or permanent residents and others, to, whether that's at the airport. I'm optimistic on the prospects of the Turkish or Qatari forces, potentially the Emiratis playing a role in reopening Hamid Karzai International Airport for civilian commercial flights, but also potentially over a land border. That's something that I want to hear more details on where those negotiations are, but we need to be focusing on, how do we still ensure we keep the promises to those who worked for us, who risked their lives for U.S. forces? How do we make sure to keep that promise after August 31st?
So you mentioned about chaos at the airport. Why evacuation went so chaotic? Is there a huge disconnect between the reality and ground and what they are deciding here in Washington? How Biden administration could respond better?
Well, one of the reasons they could have responded better was back in April when he had confirmed that he would stick with an April timeframe, or sorry, an August timeframe for withdrawal, or I guess at that point it was September. He could have moved to clear the backlog of special immigrant visa applicants. This was an issue that a bipartisan group of us, including Congressman Seth Moulton, who I went to Kabul with, we had been working, urging the administration to clear the backlog, to evacuate these individuals now, while we still had time. Because we knew that if the Taliban made rapid advances, if individuals couldn't get to Kabul from other parts of the country, from the south, from the west, from the north, if there became a more chaotic situation, our first responsibility is to American citizens and to our military forces on the ground. And so before it gets to that point, let's do everything we can to clear away this backlog and evacuate who we can. And unfortunately, the Biden administration did not listen to us. Repeatedly, we urged them on this. That was in April, in May, in June. They finally started to move a small amount of flights at the end of July, but clearly it was not enough. It was not where we needed it to be. If we would have done that, you would not have seen all of those people at the gates. It would have been a lot easier to say, these people qualify, these people don't, rather than having a far more blended mix of individuals pushing through, trying to get out. And that is one thing that we should have done, that we urged them to do, and that they did not listen to us months ago. There's a lot more we should have done better around negotiating the handoff. I'm very worried about the reports that General McKenzie at CENTCOM and Mullah Berader had sat down in Doha when President Ghani fled, and Mullah Berader said, either you guys secure Kabul or we're going to have to, or we are going to have to do that. And the US essentially said to the Taliban, go secure Kabul. I do not understand how that was a smart approach. Imagine how much better we could have managed this if within Kabul people felt a sense of security that there will be a managed transition, rather than the president fled, the Taliban have taken over, and we have no idea what comes next.
So do you think Trump's agreement with the Taliban somehow contributed to the situation in Afghanistan and what Afghan people are dealing with right now?
Obviously the withdrawal has been something that I think every president has spoken about since President Bush, and given firm timeframes on. I think it was very clear that after President Trump lost re-election, that what that agreement was could have been renegotiated, or President Biden had the opportunity to accept it or to not accept it. The thing that I think is very clear, we were down to 2,500 U.S. soldiers, U.S. troops on the ground. Now, there were many, many thousand more contractors as well, but we had some hard decisions to make. Again, what's frustrating to me is that the Biden administration charged forward without having a plan that re-examined its assumptions. If this plan is dependent on the strength and the legitimacy of the Afghan government, or the strength and legitimacy of the Afghan security forces, we entirely failed to anticipate how the removal of U.S. forces during the fighting season would have an impact on that. That I think is a catastrophic blunder and a mistake. I think there is a lot of blame to go around, but at the end of the day, President Biden is trying to say that the debate is around whether or not to withdraw, when in reality the debate isn't over that decision. Some people come down on different sides. I supported the withdrawal, as we've talked about before, but there is no question that the execution of this withdrawal has been catastrophic, has been incompetent, it's been chaos, and just an absolute nightmare. I mean, this was never going to be easy, but it certainly didn't have to be as horrific and as hard as it was.
Your background in intelligence, so there are so many finger pointing on White House intelligence, State Department about the cause of this chaotic evacuation. Wasn't there enough preparation for saving these Afghan allies? And they're still stuck there. Some of them are beaten, some cannot go back home, and some of them we don't know if they're killed or they're alive.
I know, and that is the most shameful and embarrassing and horrific component of what we could have done differently months ago. When we were saying, please move fast, evacuate who you can now, what we heard back was, we have plenty of time. It'll be 6 to 9 months after withdrawal at the very least. And when we said, well, what if you're wrong, right? I mean, maybe that's the case. You hope for the best, but we have to plan for the worst. And that went unheeded every step of the way. I know the intelligence community is saying, we pointed to these signals, we offered these warnings. It wasn't an intelligence failure. Whether it was a failure of collection, or just a failure of dissemination, or a failure of absorption and action, I think we'll have to sort out in the weeks and months to come. But this was a failure on so many levels that we absolutely need strong accountability across the board.
Both President Biden and Secretary Blinken stress on partnership with Afghanistan through economic and humanitarian support. How do you see the future of U.S. partnership with Afghanistan, given the fact Taliban are leading, they have the leadership right now?
Yeah, I think we don't know today. I think a lot depends not just on the next few weeks, but on the next few days. I hope that we maintain ties. I hope that the Taliban move to stick true to what they said about amnesty, to try not to let things return to lawlessness and reprisals. I fear that that will be the case. Again, we can hope for the best and have a plan for that, but we also need to plan for the worst. The reality is that the only real leverage the U.S. has, or the international community has, is economics, trade, and finance. And that the next crisis that's going to come is going to be an economic one. We've already seen the value of the Afghani drop quite precipitously. I think it's 10% just in the past 2 weeks. There'll be currency shortages. I know there have been a lot of individuals standing outside of banks and ATMs. So that's something we absolutely, can potentially work to stabilize in the short term. But it's going to require the Taliban to cooperate and to not be what they were, to not return to the brutality, to not be vengeful, to not continue to execute individuals, to beat individuals. That is something that we have to be working very closely to negotiate. Because again, the reality is we do not have an upper hand, and I do not want to see us go back to wide-scale conflict where the civilian fatalities, as we've seen the past 2 years, while U.S. military fatalities were very low, we had some of the highest rates of civilian deaths because of increased airstrikes. We had just tens of thousands of Afghan soldiers and policemen getting killed as well. I think in the United States, we tend to, if we're not seeing a bad headline, we think everything's okay. The reality is we're only seeing the headlines that an editor thinks matters. And the reality is that it's not reflective of the state of the conflict. So I don't think anybody wants to return to that. But what the next couple of months or years hold, I don't know today. I think we'll get a better sense of that soon.
Yeah, so Taliban didn't cut ties with Al-Qaeda and Daesh, obviously, and we have Daesh attack in Afghanistan. What happens to the future of U.S. counterterrorism mission? How they can continue and fighting back the terrorists and not to use Afghan soil against the West or U.S.?
Again, the hope, the best case scenario is that the Taliban and the United States work together on a counterterrorism mission against any who seek to use Afghanistan or neighboring areas to conduct international acts of terrorism. Whether or not that's possible, whether or not that's likely, is very much going to depend on what the going forward relationship is like between the U.S. and the Taliban. There are scenarios where that could be positive. There are scenarios where we return to direct confrontation and fighting. This is the key question in the short term. We've seen cooperation between the U.S. and the Taliban for several years now, going after Daesh, but whether or not that will continue, whether the Taliban will view it as an infringement on Afghan sovereignty, whether or not there will be agreements, struck up on that side, I don't think we know today.
So what about Afghan women? As a female journalist, I feel for those stuck in Afghanistan. I got tons of emails and contacts from these women. They are seeking help. They don't even know how to apply and how to go about it. And there was also a protest for March for Afghan Women by the White House calling for saving Afghan women lives. What happens to them and how they can be helped?
Again, I think if there was one benefit to 20 years of American reconstruction and occupation in Afghanistan, it's that, and you are among this group, there are a number of Afghan individuals who have seen alternatives to what the Taliban have to offer, who will not be satisfied to return to the pre-9/11, the pre-2001 Afghanistan. I think it is essential that the Taliban respect that. Now, it's going to be a different reality in Kabul as it would be in Kandahar city. That was the case before the Taliban took over in just the past couple of weeks. Afghanistan is a very diverse country. And I think one of the failures of our nation building was believing that you could have a strong central government in such a diffuse, spread out, and diverse country as Afghanistan, with the amount of just ethnic differences, tribal differences, sectarian, political, all of those different ways that there were different leadership structures and different affinity structures. So I hope that there is room in the U.S. I think we need to make sure that there is room for especially for Afghans, for Afghan women who want to pursue an education, who want to pursue a career. I think the Taliban would be making a sincere mistake in terms of hampering Afghanistan's growth and their ability to be reaching the country's potential if they turn that opportunity down. Now, again, no one should go into any negotiation with the Taliban hoping for the best and planning for that best. We should be planning for the worst and making sure we are not satisfied with anything short of full respect. But this will be a hard situation to manage because, as you know, Afghanistan is a very conservative country, and Kabul for the past 2 decades has been very different than most other parts of the country.
Just last question, sir. I don't want to take too much of your time. 9/11 is close, the anniversary. This U.S. is winding up the longest war in Afghanistan. How do you assess this war going on and some beliefs that it went wrong? What went really wrong, and what has been the success for this 20 years of war in Afghanistan? Was it worth it?
I do not think it was worth it. I think we have inflicted more tragedy and suffered more tragedy than was prevented. There are many different worlds, that could have come about. One world is if the Taliban turned over Osama bin Laden in the days or weeks after 9/11. Another world is if the U.S. left or focused on its mission, in 2002 and 2003 when the Taliban were at their weakest, and instead of continuing to get distracted and shifting into Iraq. Another world is if we would have left after Osama bin Laden died and said, this is the time for us to manage this transition. We have time and again delayed or not taken the right course of action simply because if you look back over the past almost 20 years and you ask at any one year, you ask that general, what is our mission? You're going to get a different answer. We never really said what we were there to do, what we went into Afghanistan to do. It was deny terrorist sanctuaries. It was to build a democratic government. It was to protect women's rights. It was to counter narcotics trafficking. It was to go after money laundering. It was to have a base to go and be able to see what was going on in Iran or Russia or China, the strategic question, minerals. I mean, we had 1,000 different reasons why we were there, but none was really the priority. And at the end of the day, having and building a stable, legitimate Afghan government was never the priority and always took a backseat to counter terrorism, to counter narcotics, or to any other mission. And as a result, when we needed that government, when the people needed that government, it wasn't there.